But I wanted that idea, and I think it's why I started with cities, because they're so much more cosmopolitan. It's that idea of, walk down an alley in any major city in the setting, you will find something really weird. Yeah, and to you it's weird, but to the rest of the setting, it's like, no, that's Dave.
Welcome to Tabletop Talk, a unique podcast where I delve into the minds of creatives in the tabletop gaming space. I'm here to uncover their creative processes and inspirations, driven by my passion for understanding who they are and why they create. Enjoy this interview with Neal Litherland, the creator of Army Men and Sundara, Dawn of a New Age. We talk about how he found D&D fiction before finding the actual RPG, the origins of his Sundara setting, how he reworked the game Army Men using his affinity for math and mechanics, and we go deep in talking about the ethics of AI art. Okay, sit back, relax, grab a couple green Army Men, and enjoy my time with Neal.
This is Chris Spivey. When I'm not looking for another ball of scotch, you'll find me listening to Tabletop Talk.
Howdy friends, Craig here. My guest today is Neal Litherland. He is an author and RPG creator. He's behind Sundara, Dawn of a New Age, and Army Men. Neal, welcome to the third floor.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
So Neal, I got to subject you to the question that you've answered on every podcast you've been on, which is essentially your origin story. So at one point, you knew nothing about tabletop role-playing. You knew nothing about grabbing a sheet of paper, rolling some dice, and pretending to be somebody else. And then it was put in front of you for the very first time. Can you take me back to that moment?
I can. It's actually, I have a three-part origin story, which always amuses me to tell. Because I came into contact with RPGs 3 separate times, and it took it that many times to take. The first time, there was a friend of mine who had kind of tried to make his own homebrew game, and I had no idea what he was doing, but I was game for it. So it was one of those one player, one game master sort of things. And I'd written stories before. I'd done group writing exercises. I'm in middle school, so I'm like, okay, this is fun. Yes, it's a little weird. I don't know if our friends would really understand what we're doing here, but I'm game for it. I'll give it a shot. And so we did a couple sessions of it. I didn't really know where he was going with it, but I was having fun. And then he sort of lost interest, moved on, then ended up moving away. And I was like, oh, that was a thing I just filed away in the back of my head and forgot about. And then a few years later, back in the days when malls had both Walden Books and a B. Dalton. There was a red box for the second edition of D&D on sale at Walden Books, and I had zero clue what it was. I just knew it was $10, and I was willing to take a shot on it.
Now, had you associated it at all with what you and your friend had done earlier, or it was completely unknown to you?
I had never come across anyone who had done RPGs at all. I had done a couple of computer-based RPGs, but other than that, over my head, no idea. And so I bought it thinking it was some kind of a book or a fun little art pack. And then I get it home and I was like, this makes no sense. What the heck is this? And so I'm going through it and I'm trying to figure out what all the dice are for and what THACO means and whatnot. I had no idea. It wasn't just a board game. I thought it was abnormally complicated. And after a couple of friends and I had given it a try, we're like, oh, okay, we are either doing this wrong or this is just not well made. So we put it back in the box and we put it under my bed and we forgot about it. And then when I was in college, I had a friend of mine who had actually run a D&D table before, and he invited me to come join his games. He was like, yeah, you seem nerdy, and we share this class together. I'm sure you'll like this. And so it was right during the D&D 3.0, 3.5 transition. And so I show up, and it was the first time I'd had someone who knew what RPGs were, and I was at a table with people who knew what RPGs were. And it finally all clicked of, oh, this is what this is. And this is what happened. This is how it's supposed to run. Okay. And that was when I discovered that I am capable of rolling 11 natural ones in a single setting. But yeah, that was my origin story of the universe. Really wanted me to get into RPGs for some reason, and it finally took.
Obviously, you're out of college. You're a little bit older now, and you've been far more involved in the hobby since then. But looking back on it, do you have a sense of what clicked? So what happened in that first session and the subsequent sessions that made this a prominent part of what you do now?
Yeah, it was actually it's a thing I've said to lots of people who've asked me, do you still play video games even though you do all this? And I've been spoiled when it comes to gaming, and it was that idea of freedom. As clearly anyone who's played an RPG knows, you can't jump off a cliff, roll a die, and start flying. But it was that idea of, because I know that code has so many limitations, there are only so many paths you can think of that you can program. And with a tabletop RPG, you can just look at whoever is sitting behind the screen and go, I want to do this thing. Is that possible? And then they can figure out something to at least give you a chance to try. And that was very involving for me. And I really liked that, the ability to just take that freedom to try whatever. And even if it fails gloriously, you may still have a fun story to tell about it. And then, after that, I found out that, I have whatever spicy chemicals in my brain, makes me really like numbers. And so there's that Rubik's Cube satisfaction of when you find the right combination of abilities and whatnot that lets you do what you really want. And then you get to show it to your friends. They're like, yes, that's very interesting. Can you please stop playing with your model train set?
So if I were to go to the Neal Museum and go through all the different exhibits, would I only see D&D, or were there other games that really had a big impact on you as far as your journey?
Oh, many, many games. It was a thing that I actually didn't think about it until I was talking to somebody else on a different podcast, and they brought it up, and I realized this I had read a lot of tie-in fiction without knowing it was tie-in fiction when I was younger. I had my grandparents, I remember my grandfather in particular, he found a collection of the old first edition Greyhawk novels, or second edition, whichever edition it was. I had no idea what they were. It was cool. I enjoyed the art. I enjoyed the stories. I really wish I'd saved them because they're probably worth something now. But so I got all of those. I read a lot of Ed Greenwood. I read a lot of BattleTech novels. I read a lot of just anything I could get my hands on. And then I found out that lots of them were like, oh, these aren't games based on the books. These were books made to get you to play the game. And so when I had, friends or roommates or other folks, in the game, they'd be like, hey, I think you might like this game. It's Call of Cthulhu. It's based on, so how many of the mythos authors are we including in this? And they would just stop and go, how much of it have you read? I have read a great deal of it, in the case you're wondering. It's I have no idea how the game works. I don't know the mechanics, but I know all of the old ones, and I am here for this.
So being so rooted in the fiction aspect of it, right? So, this is the non-mechanical world, stories being told in these settings. How does that impact you as a player or as a GM? And then obviously as a creator, but let's start when you're at the table, having all of that fiction crammed in your brain and these worlds crammed in your brain. Do you see that change how you played or ran games?
It changes a lot of what I try to do, depending on, of course, how open the world is and how much history has been established and how much of it's just, do whatever you want. For Chronicles of Darkness players out there, you know what I'm talking about. But a lot of it is I will find a corner of the world, or I'll find a question of well, the lore doesn't say this can't happen. So what are the circumstances that require this event to transpire? Whether it's, a inhuman character with a weird bloodline that would normally be, put to death, or there's, someone who's been raised by this fantastical species of creatures that normally wouldn't happen. You have kind of a reverse Tarzan. And those are the questions that I always try to ask. And then sometimes I just have the question of okay, what if we give this really overpowered ability to somebody who has no idea how powerful it is, and we just turn them loose on the setting? What happens?
Right. So let's pretend that you just get done with the perfect 5 sessions of gaming. Just you walk away from it and you're like, holy shit. That's the apex mountain, right? This was the best gaming I've ever had. And then I made you sit down and rank system, setting, table. I'd be curious to know, where do you think they would rank, right? So if you were to say the biggest reason this was great was because of this, I'm trying to get a sense of importance. So when you look at system versus setting versus table.
I would say probably my top slot is usually going to go to Pathfinder Classic, or First Edition, as people insist on calling it now because I'm old.
No, not what the system is, but you understand what I'm saying? So what system you're playing, that's more important than the table, or is the table more important than that? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, I got you now. Yep. Answer is still the same, but for different reasons.
Sure.
I am very drawn to mechanics. So system is going to be one of those of I have a agree to disagree attitude with lots of folks who really like rules light games. But for me, it is one of those of, if games have very heavy, well, not necessarily heavy mechanics, but if there's a lot of moving parts, if there's a lot of physics of the world have been decided, I find it really cuts down on arguments over well, can I X or can I not X? Because both you and whoever's running the game could just open the book to page 357 and see, well, that's how much falling damage you take. This is not the GM being unfair. This is not the player being unreasonable. That's just the way it is. And so like, system is usually my biggest requirement. It's not always number one. Sometimes setting will beat out system for folks who've tried to get me into Shadowrun. I took one look at the system and I was like, oh no, but the setting is so great.
Yeah.
And there's also the question of, is it an official published setting or is it a homebrew setting? Because sometimes like somebody will make me a pitch for their homebrew and I'm like, that sounds really cool. How much of it do you have figured out beyond this pitch? Because I can't just go to a website or go to a bookstore and just grab the actual book and read it for myself. I have to trust whoever's running it to give it to me piecemeal.
And then the tables is third, right? So the interactions of the players. So going back to the system aspect. So it sounds to me like mechanics are important. You need a bit of a simulation level of mechanics to really satisfy you. What is the exception to that? Have you come across a rules-like game that transcended that? And maybe it was because the setting and the table was so good, right? But I'm trying to get a sense of a story game that you think was the exception that proves the rule, maybe.
Yeah, I've had a couple of really good experiences with rules-light games. The one that I had a really good experience with, both as a player and as the storyteller, was Grimm, which I believe is unfortunately out of print right now.
I've never heard of Grimm. What's Grimm?
Grimm is lovely. It started off as a D20 modern plug and chug, essentially, and it was very convoluted. And when I first read it, that was the version I saw. And I was like, I don't know if this is really what I like, because I like D20 modern, but this seems a little much. Yep. The gist of it, for other folks who've never heard of it, is it's a class-based RPG. It takes 2d6 and that's it. It's very simple mechanically. The numbers, you have a grade from 1 to 12. I can explain the whole game in about 30 seconds of roll your dice. Did you get 2 to 5? Cool. Whatever your grade level is, that's the number you succeeded at. If you rolled a 1, go down, roll again. If you roll a 6, go up, roll again. You now know everything you need to know to play Grimm. But the classes are all based on kind of the cliques of elementary and middle school. So you have classes like the jock, the bully, the nerd, the dreamer, the normal kid. And the plot of it is you were all sucked into the Grimlands, which is that place that, Jacob and Wilhelm put together with their book, and they bound all of these bizarre creatures in another world. And now your kid's stuck there trying to get out.
Interesting.
And so it's got that thing of like, but the German fairy tales were so much darker. Let's just crank that up to 13 or 14 and just go nuts with it. And it's a game that can be either very like darkly whimsical, or it's a game that can just be flat out horror. And It really depends on what you and your group's looking for. So it's very easy to fix the numbers on the fly, and it's very easy to kind of match your tone to what your group likes. And it's one of the very few exceptions that if someone said, well, I kind of want to run this, I'd be like, I'm there. What day of the week you got?
That's awesome. So guys, the Insider Insights series allows me to sit down with designers, developers, artists, writers, and creators and learn how they approach their work. I try to understand their process, inspiration, and the methods for crafting their creations. We're going to take a quick break. When we get back from this break, we're going to learn about Sundara, Dawn of a New Age. We'll be right back. This is the part of many podcasts where someone comes on, interrupts the show, and explains that you should consider paying for the content that you're listening to right now for free. That pitchman explains by giving $1 or more a month, you not only support the show, but you allow the show to grow and improve. Here on the third floor, we refuse to interrupt your episode of Tabletop Talk with such time-wasting pleas. We pledge never to run a spot asking you to go to patreon.com and give $1 or more a month, because supporting content creators keeps the content coming, even if there is a link in the show's description. And there is. We don't ask you to click it and become a patron. We don't waste time rambling about the benefits like early access to episodes, getting episodes without ad breaks like this, or even getting a chance to play in one of Craig's RPG sessions. Anyway, enjoy this episode knowing Tabletop Talk, despite being supported by its patrons, won't engage in such blatant appeals for support. So before we dive in to how this came to be, can we give kind of a back of the box synopsis of what Sundara is?
Absolutely. Sundara is a high fantasy setting that, unlike a lot of the other high fantasy games out there, is not trying to reclaim some mythic past. It's not trying to recapture some golden age. It's trying to move forward into the future, and it acknowledges that while we all have our myths, we all have our legends, the past is never as great as we think it is, and you're not going to find the answers you need to solve the challenges you face, today back there.
So I think I understand what that means, but I'm not 100% sure. So when you say it's not rooted in the past, are you saying from a lore perspective, it doesn't lead into like 30,000 years ago, this happened and the sun got blotted out and stuff like that? So help me out a little bit.
Sure. There's that theme that not most, but a lot of high fantasy has. It started with Lord of the Rings. We see it with various other settings of there's always that golden age where we had this perfect mastery of magic and all this amazing technology. And then there was an event, whatever the event was.
Yep.
And, we lost so much of it. Now, while we still have magic, we still have civilization today. We're finding all of these great wonders from the past just buried around here and trying to understand where we came from. And Sundara doesn't have that. It has much more of a timeline where it's like, there were empires before, there will be empires in the future, but, we don't have anyone going around trying to reconquer ancient lands, trying to rebuild all these old empires. It's if you find an ancient sword deep in a tomb somewhere, chances are you're going to wrap it up very carefully and take it to a museum because it's not going to be as good as what you have on your hip today.
Interesting. So kind of a progress, for lack of better words, in technology and in civilization, and more linear as opposed to we hit a peak, everything went to shit, and then now we're trying to reclaim that. That's cool. So
with an extra buried aspect of some of the peaks that we had, we didn't fix, and now there's a problem that is going to get out of control if we don't get our hands on it.
So tons of high fantasy settings out there.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Where does this start? So where do you start going, wait a minute, maybe there could be something else. So what's the acorn that grew this tree?
I'd say there were two origins. The first is, the practical side of when my publisher, they usually kick me ideas. Sometimes I kick them ideas. Of one of these supplements they had me write was 10 fantasy villages, just a very general high fantasy supplement of like, hey, you got a lot of empty space on your map. Put one of these down. Here's some stuff to get you started. And, folks like that. So obviously the follow up to that is like, hey, let's do a book of cities, because, that's what you do. Mm-hmm. You do something bigger. You do something more involved. And I love cities, and I didn't want to cram a whole bunch of them into a book. So I was like, no, we should do like one book per city. And then I realized like these cities are getting.
So real quick, though, why do you love cities so much? So why cities versus villages?
I find cities more fantastical than I do rural areas. I have been in lots of different, I've been in woods, I've been in mountains, I've traveled a bit, and it's always that same thing of the glory of nature. Whew, I don't have any internet. How do I get out of here? But when I go to a city, there's always something new to discover, whether it's, what's the mystery, what do I find down this alley? What do I find like in the basement of this place? Where is this abandoned subway station? There's sediments of history, but at the same time, you're still surrounded by people. And I find that very interesting. And it's a thing that I think, while obviously high fantasy is full of amazing cities, from Minas Tirith on forward. But I feel like a lot of time in gaming, we kind of use those as a stopping point of like, we go there to flog our loot and then we get the heck out of there unless it's very important to the plot.
Right.
And what I wanted to do with cities in Sundara is, unlike, because when you think of fantasy settings, particularly high fantasy settings, you usually have nations in mind, that very modern idea of the nation state. And Sundara doesn't have those at all. So like there's no countries, you have city states. So like the cities have like, their area of influence, and some people that don't exactly pay them fealty, but they have, an agreement with the outstanding towns of like, if you need something, you write to us and we'll help you. And in return, give us however much of your grain or whatever their arrangement is. And it was a thing I wanted to explore with that, of having a fantasy setting that is both quote unquote period, in that the idea of like nations are kind of like time zones. There was no reason to really invent them before a certain point. So everywhere you go is going to be kind of its own little independent floating island, but a lot of them are going to be connected to each other in weird and unexpected ways, either due to historical events or a certain resource or manufacturing chain that they're put together with. And I wanted it to feel very organic for players to just kind of explore and find that, the whole of all these civilizations, while they each have their own little part of the map, all of them are connected in ways, both political, both economic. And so if something happens in one city or in one town, you get a butterfly effect of eventually that's going to affect other places in the setting. And that's going to be a question a lot of the time that players have to deal with of, hey, we did this thing over here. Okay, now the people in this castle over on this area want to know why you did that. And, so it really takes away that idea that what you do, because I've seen this happen a lot for high fantasy games in particular, of there's this attitude that what you do kind of happens in a vacuum.
Right.
Of like, I raided this tomb and I took all the treasure and this thing is now different. Okay, what does that do to the surrounding area? And then once those changes come into play, how does that snowball, which are some of the questions that players will have to answer.
So how do you start something like this? So I mean, it's easy for me to grab the book now and flip through it and see all of this webs of interconnections. This is independent. This is tied to that. If I do A, I've got to realize that B could happen now before it wouldn't have. But where do you start when you're staring at the blank notebook?
Oh yeah, it started with partially an assignment and partially because there is a phrase that I hear a lot from game masters that echoes in my mind and frustrates me greatly. It is a thing I never want to do as a GM. And it's always, no, that's too weird. Okay. And I'm just having that moment of, but we're playing a high fantasy game. Weird is what we're here for. We're not playing, sword and sorcery where everybody's humans, where we're here for the weird stuff. And so that was a lot of what I wanted to do with this setting of really just uproot that idea that it's like, oh no, there's only 25 halflings in this region and there's only these 9 elves that anybody's ever heard of. So now bring whatever weirdness you want, any kind of nonsense you can think of, it's here. And it was things like, obviously there's going to be some parts of the map that are more favored to certain activities or certain places than others, but I wanted that idea, and I think it's why I started with cities, because they're so much more cosmopolitan. It's that idea of, walk down an alley in any major city in the setting, you will find something really weird. Yeah, and to you it's weird, but to the rest of the setting, it's like, no, that's Dave. Yeah, he's an alchemist. Didn't he just blow up a building? Is it Tuesday?
So for GMs that are flipping through the book and getting ready to run this, if I were to survey 20 of them and say, what was the weirdest thing? When we know that Neal loves weird, now that you're done reading this, what do you think is the weirdest? Can you give me a sense of the kind of the far end of that spectrum?
Oh, it's I tried to make everything stand out in its own way for something, but I think there's 2 of them, that really take the cake. One is kind of traditional, and it's Archbliss, the floating city of the sorcerers. So it's that whole thing of, your fantasy setting has a floating city. There's a bunch of all just nonsensical, magical, hullabaloo going on up there. And it's just a web of connections and noble families arguing over who gets what marriages and what kind of children is that going to produce. And if somebody doesn't get their way, how many lightning bolts are the rest of the citizens going to have to dodge? And, that was our first villain coded city, which I had fun with. And the other is Horde Reach City of Worms.
Okay.
And it is a thing I did for dragons, particularly in this setting, because Sundara doesn't have an alignment system. So I saw no reason to have both chromatic and metallic dragons. So all dragons are chromatic. That's the way it is. And so we had, the foundation of the city. It was formed on what's called a sky island, which is an actual thing in geology of it's when you have a kind of mountain that stands alone and it has multiple environments on it, essentially.
Okay.
So you had 5 separate dragons of 5 separate colors all just rolled up to this place, hoping to claim it as their territory. And they were all very young dragons at the time. And they all sort of realized as they were squaring up of, oh, one of us might win, but all of us are going to lose. And one of them made the absurd, idea of like, what if we shared it? And they all just had that moment of, why would we do that? As well, do you want to live on top of the mountain? No, it's freezing. I want to live in the core of the mountain where it's hot. So do you want to be in there? No, I want the swamp over there on the base. That's where I want to be. And they all just kind of realized very slowly if they each wanted a different piece of it, so it became a shared territory. And because it was a shared territory of 5 dragons, all of whom are now growing in power and size and influence, they had a bunch of people come there who were kind of outcast from other places. So it just ended up becoming a city of monsters. So you have your goblins, your hobgoblins, your strix, your gargoyles, your any kind of monstrous humanoid creature where a game master's usually like, no, I don't want one of those in the party, really too problematic. Like there's entire districts of them in Horde Reach. And they'll just show up and pay their taxes and live their lives.
So if I pick up my party that I'm running this and I drop them in here, where do they go? Right. So how do they live in this city? How do they interact with this city? Can you give me a sense of the party shows up and...
Sure. It's a thing I tried to include for a lot of them. The cities all have potential plot hooks if you're looking to do just adventure, and it's plot hooks by district. So by the time you get to the end of it, there's like 20 or some odd plot hooks per book. But even if you just want, walking tour of the city to give people an idea of weirdness, Horde Reach is the beginning of the airship trade. Airships in the setting are kind of a new invention, and they're made with the hulls are scaled with the cast off scales of all the dragons, and through various alchemical processes kept secret by the city that allows them to fly. And so if it's one of those of like, well, we want to take an airship, well, you need to go here. That's where they dock. Or you might have we have this weird, obscure dragon artifact that we found. We have no idea what it is. We'll go ask one of the founders. Maybe they know. And so you can go and you can get your appointment and they can have a meeting with you. And you get that fun moment of putting your players in a room with a really powerful dragon, not to fight it.
Right.
Or you might have, you did a thing in the area. Now the founders wish to award you and give you some kind of cool treasure.
So let's focus on that city for a second, because this has helped me understand your process a little bit. So we've got 20 some odd plot hooks that you've pieced together for this city. You love them all the same, but one a little bit more. So thinking about like the plot hooks that you built for this city, what is one that really you kind of sit back down and go, I'm still really proud of that one. That's a good one.
It's really obvious, but I love it partially because it seems so obvious. Players would be like, no, that's not what's going on. So it acts as kind of a double fake. But there's each district of the city itself, because a thing I did for dragons is they have what's called a worm mark of a dragon that is in a place for any period of time will begin leaving their impression on the area. But because so many of them are in one place at one time, each district of the city has notably different weather patterns and temperature, because you can sort of tell who's running what on a block by block basis. And I cannot remember what I named the red off the top of my head. It's I'd have to look it up. But, they kind of have their own delegates and representatives that run the city when they're off doing important dragon things. They don't want to be bothered. And so there's a lot of kobolds that run things on behalf of the red dragon, including curating the museum that she is very proud of, that she leaves open to the public, of her beautiful artwork that she collects, much of which is made of glass for no particular reason. But it's this whole thing of we have like the older like female kobold who's kind of like grandmother, whatever I named her, because I wrote this book 3 years ago.
Sure.
But, so it's like all the kobolds know her. She's been kind of like the paternal or the maternal figure for the whole community. And you start asking them, well, how long has she been around here? And everyone's just, how long has it been? And people is like, it's 20 years? No, it's got to be at least 40 years. No, it's got to be longer than that. And it's whatever it is. Everyone agrees it's way beyond a normal kobold lifespan. And there's all these rumors about how she managed to do this. One of the most ridiculous rumors being that she is, in fact, a disguise used by the Red Dragon so that she can get like the day-to-day business of the place done without everyone constantly bowing and scraping and getting in the way of everything.
And so now talk to me about that as a hook, right? So how do I get my players to engage with that and engage with her?
Yeah, it is one of those things of, if you are a storyteller, you can choose to make this rumor true or false. I don't tell people one way or the other to do it. So if you want to make that like a whole thing of maybe one of the other dragons in the city has heard this and wants to find out if it's true, particularly if it's the black dragon down at the base, because he needs to know whether or not one is being put over on him because he's paranoid. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's just the players. One of them has an appreciation for art and they've heard this rumor and they think it's very funny, so they go to hang out with the curator. It's going to depend, partially on, who's at your table and what you want to do and all that nonsense. But, you can meet her in any of the various like structures in this part of the city. You can find her out at the firing range where we teach the new sorcerers how to throw fire and not hurt anyone. You can find her in the glassworks, and there's all these different conversations and things you could start up with, and you can just kind of drop those hints of is she or isn't she? And if you really want to get to the end of it, of depending on if the players have done something to ingratiate themselves, or if one of them is a kobold or perhaps a sorcerer that has a bloodline tied to this dragon, you can reveal to them one way or the other for your version of the setting, is she or isn't she, with that, that thing of like, the players put in the work, now they get a secret.
So Neal, as we go through this path of creation, right, we start with nothing, we start building, we start adjusting, and it's often a windy path, right, that eventually leads to where you ended up. Were there any hard right turns? Was there any critical decisions where you were headed in a direction, you stopped, threw it away, and then took a right turn? Or was it pretty consistent? You just kept building off of everything as you went?
With this particular setting, it's been pretty consistent, but I will occasionally get ideas like halfway through a supplement and be like, oh, I should have made this wider. It's never I should have narrowed this. It's always I should have done this other thing too. And I always jot the note down on the side of like, okay, we'll come back to that if the readers are like, no, that was cool, but I want more. A good example of this is Gnomes of Sundara, which was part of the species releases I did. I wanted to do all the base species that folks could normally play in one of these games. And I wanted to kind of capture the same kind of lightning that Paizo did with gnomes, because I didn't just want them to be halflings, but pranksters. And so I made them descendants from nymphs, of like, that's sort of their thing of they were sprung out of, these various waters because they needed helpers, they needed protectors, and they couldn't do everything on their own. And as I started doing more research and checking various things, I realized / remembered that like nymphs were not just water based. They, came from all the different elements. And so I got halfway through the book and I was like, okay, we'll save that for later. If people really like gnomes, we'll do a book of forest gnomes and a book of, mountain gnomes and all those other ones. So people can have 20 options instead of just 5, if that's what everybody wants.
Very, very nice. So it's obvious when you're creating an entire system, right, that playtesting is critical. But when you're creating a setting, is playtesting part of this process?
It varies. There's going to be some times where it's less of a playtest and more of a, I usually think of it as like a test run. When I think of a play test, it's usually like we're going to do a whole session and everybody's going to make characters and we're going to go through a story. When I think of just a test run, it's like, okay, I have this magic item. Let's pick 3 or 4 encounters and just run that encounter to see how broken it is or how ridiculous it is. Or I'll call up a friend of mine who also loves twisting mechanics until they scream and be like, hey, how broken is this? Can you think of a thing I have overlooked that would make this really ridiculous? And sometimes they do. And sometimes it's like, oh no, that's actually not all that powerful. It does this thing was good. That's what I wanted. And so it's usually when making new or altered items that either don't have a, what's the word I'm thinking of? They don't have like a clone or a dupe in another sort of game. It's not just this magic item, but with a thing changed. I was very lucky for a couple of them in that I had found either other third-party folks who had listed out, their mechanics and how they did it. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. Let's twist that a little bit and change it up. Aether weapons is a good example of their essentially air-based firearms from Silkgift, the city of Sales, which is where all the mad scientists go to make weird stuff. And I had seen other folks do something like that, and that was kind of my answer to all of the folks who really like high fantasy and they like that high adventure, but when you start bringing in black powder firearms, they start balking a little bit. So I was like, no, there's no black powder involved. It's just this weirdness. And because it's sort of a localized weirdness, then they get the question of like, okay, this exists. How did it get to this city, to this town, to this person? And then you have that whole kind of side story as to like, well, how did this weird character of yours get a hold of something so rare?
So listening to you talk, Neal, a couple things that I'm picking up on, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of these. One, it's very clear that mechanics is important and significant for you, if not the most important, based on what we talked about earlier. And then when I ask you about playtesting, the focus is on let's run this, right? Let's run this to see mechanically where it comes. And I think I know the answer, but I want to talk about it. how do you feel about the debate of balance in RPGs, right? So there's those that say balance is critical. If a game is not balanced, if there are items and abilities in a game that are unbalanced, that it's going to quote unquote break the game and make it unplayable or something I won't enjoy, versus those that say, no, like that's the best part, right? When there is no balance, there's no need for balance. Can you give me a sense of where you fall on that spectrum?
I can do my best of it as a thing. It's something that I found particularly with more mechanically dense games of it is important to have balance for, obvious reasons of you don't want someone like rolling up at level 1 with 3 pet dragons. But, there's also that thing of I have seen so many people complain about how X, Y, or Z ability or item or whatever is so broken and so unbalanced. And then I asked them, like, well, did you put them in a brightly lit room with no cover and give them 2.5 hours to prepare all their bonuses before this fight? And so there are so many different ways that you can alter the situation. And that often helps a lot of the time if you're a game master who feels like, well, this, mechanics should be made to overcome certain problems and to deal with certain solutions. And if one thing can be used to solve every problem, the question at that point is that the problem of the tool, or is that the problem of the person who keeps setting up nails and complaining that the hammer is driving them really good?
Got it. How do you know when you're done? So let's focus on cities, right? So how do you know, or are you just told, like, pens down, this is going to print?
Generally speaking, for the cities that I've made I have a bit of a cheat method, which is that's the Watabu Fantasy City Generator is the name of the thing out there. It's a program out there. I believe anyone can use it for free, and you can put it in your various publications if you just want to save yourself design of. So I'll go there and I'll click through until I find a map that I really like. And the current version allows you to name it yourself, which is really good because the random name generator was not always on point. But, at that point, so I have a city, it has a name, and it's got, a basic look, and it's got all the districts named. At that point, I have a fill in the blank job. So it's like, okay, here's your city. Here's all your districts. Each district gets X treatment of like, here's 3 places. Here's 3 notable NPCs. Here's 3 rumors that you'll find there. Here's a general history of it. Done. And then once I've filled in all the blanks for that city and I've given everybody sort of an overview, it goes to print and it has that question of, okay, it's out there. Which one do people like? And then based on like reader reaction or how many people are like, oh my God, I really liked this one, I will then ask the audience the question of like, okay, do you want more? Do you want me to do an adventure path there? Or do you want me to write a short story from there? Or do you want to hear audio dramas or anything like that? And I don't always get a lot of reaction, but when you look at the sales numbers, you can just kind of figure out, well, like who liked which ones most.
So talking about reactions, then once this thing is unleashed, whatever it is, right? You have guesses on what the reactions are, but there's always surprises. Can you think of a recent surprise where you put something out there and what came back? Feedback was like, oh wow, didn't see that coming.
Yeah, I was very surprised of essentially the third phase of it, which is what I've been working on recently. I call it it's essentially groups or factions. They're mostly faction books. You have like, Cell Swords of Sundara, which is a bunch of mercenary companies. You have Cults of Sundara, which is obviously cults, and just Merchants of Sundara was the one that most recently dropped. And I expected more of a reaction to that, based on previous sales and other things, because not just, hey, here's some cool history for some groups and here's some ways you could use them in your game. But each one came with, either if it's the Pathfinder version, it came with a archetype, or if it's the D&D version, it came with a subclass. And those are things that I really, really enjoy as a player. And I figured it's like, hey, these are things that people will really get into. Or I believe Cults came with a bunch of magic items. Nice. Merchants didn't actually come with much. That one was very, very user-friendly for any edition. But I expected people to really just get into that. But I may have just overestimated just how full the market is with just the mechanics of stuff.
Right.
Because it seemed people were way more into setting stuff than they were into any of the mechanics. So that's something I'm trying to take in going forward. Of people seem to be more drawn to what's unique about this place, or what are some stories I could tell here, versus like, yeah, but what do I get if I join the Jackdaws, as a mercenary?
So there's people listening right now and they're like, oh, this is interesting to me. I may want to explore this, like look into this, maybe incorporate it or run inside of this world. But for whatever reason, they can only buy 3 books. in your mind, for someone who has none of this but wants to start with it, what are the 3 books we should recommend?
Absolutely. The books I would recommend, if you only have 3 to pick, get Cities of Sundara Ironfire, which was the first one, kind of the base of the setting. Gods of Sundara, which talks about how the divine works in this particular setting. And if you had to pick a 3rd book, either grab Merchants of Sundara or grab Guilds of Sundara, as those give you an idea of some of the bigger power structures that are going on in the world and who you're likely to run into.
So now I'm going to pick your brain. So what was your thought process in coming up with those 3? So why those 3?
I find that Ironfire was really a tone setter for what I did going forward from that point, both in terms of what are things that are possible, but also it's a thing lots of high fantasy settings will do. If they pick their New York, their Rome, whoever their oldest city is, it's always like, this is the city that has stood at the center of the world for 10,000 years and it's overseen however many apocalypses. But, Ironfire's been around less than a century. So it's a very, for lack of a better term, an American idea of like going from nothing to one of the biggest industrial powerhouses in this area of the country. And I wanted that to be kind of an attitude that people took going forward, of just because something is old or just because it's been established for a really long time doesn't necessarily mean that it's a place that should be inherently honored or respected, or that it's not, run through with corruption. And just because something's new, that doesn't mean that it doesn't know what it's doing, or that there's people there who don't have experience, with politics or with adventure or with anything like that. For, gods, it's I altered the way things work that a lot of, if you're a Warhammer Fantasy player, you'll be very familiar with this setup. But if you're a more traditional D&D Pathfinder player, you won't be familiar with this. There's only 2 realms. So I did away with the whole convoluted, 17 different sub-realms and 8 billion deities. We have the physical realm that, everybody's all used to. This is where you live and where all the trees and rocks and all that are. And then there's the prim, or the primal, the weird, the weft, whatever people across the setting end up calling it, because no one agrees, and scholars are very, very divided on things. But it's the realm of all of the divinities, all of the outsiders, and it's the realm that all your magic comes through. The only difference between your divine casters, your arcane casters, and all the different classes is how do you access what comes from this other plane. And I made it not vague, but I made it flexible enough so that if it was one of those of but I really like this deity that I made, and I'm worried about it fitting mythology, of there are hundreds of different mythologies across the setting. And it's a thing I did with the deities of they have faces. So you could have the same god appear to 20 different, peoples throughout the setting, and it'll be vastly different in how it appeared and the particular legends it has. But its portfolio, for lack of a better term, will always have the same core elements. So it's kind of a build your own god, and it also gives you 10 gods you can use just as a starter if you don't want to do that. And for guilds and merchants, it was one of those of, as I mentioned, because there's cities and there's towns and there's regional alliances, but not nations. They're one of the bigger fill-in power structures. So if you want to have, a group that has a really big backer sending them out to go do stuff, you make a guild their paymaster. If you want them to have a really widespread conspiracy they're dealing with, or a bunch of enemies, or an organization that's sprawling and big enough that there are different players within it that are waging wars against each other, you're more likely to find that with either a guild or a merchant empire, because they're set up in all the different cities and they have their own interests that they're pursuing.
So listening to the origin story, listening to the kind of the path of creation for this setting, the one theme I keep hearing is, and this is not great phrasing, but hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say, is a disregard for the past. Oh, yeah. You've got the first book you mentioned is very an up and comer that came out of nowhere and is a huge deal. One of the key things you mentioned to me when we talked about, what makes this different was this idea that the past just isn't as important as what you might be used to in high fantasy. Where does that come from, Neal?
I think a lot of it is I can't remember the particular name of the trope, but I want to say it's old is always better. Mm-hmm. And it's that idea of we lost the way to make this particular item, or we've lost this particular school of magic. And it's that question I've always had when you look at just our history in the real world of we've lost so many weird manufacturing technologies and so many cool ideas and so many stories. And we either always rediscover them or like within a couple of generations, if you get enough people together and we put all of our different scholarships to work on the same issue, we always find, if not the same method, we always come up with something new. And that was a thing I wanted to try and embrace, not just with the setting and the story, but I wanted to kind of give that to players of it's less of was like, well, like I'm going to like become a king and I'm going to establish all this land because that's the way things have always been done. It's a thing you find across the setting of every city that I mentioned has its own political structure. It's like no one uses the same government style. So why tie yourself to any way we've always done things? Be weird, show up and make diplomatic overtures to the orcs who are raiding this town. Who knows? Maybe it'll work.
So, Neal, I want to get an idea of you. And I want to get an idea of your fingerprints. So I go to one of your friends and I give them 2 books, right? 2 books from Sundara. And I tell him, Neal wrote one of these. He didn't write the other one. And I asked them to flip through both books. What would make them correctly pick it? Right. So where is your DNA in this work? What makes this unique that only you could have made it?
Part of it is honestly just going to be like the flow of the way that I write, because when I get really excited about things, I get a particular, how's it been described, of fantasy boilerplate almost. I have that. It's a very, that's probably the wrong term for it, but it's a very, it's been described as workman-like prose.
Okay.
It's like poetry by the numbers, as some folks have said. But the other bit of it is going to be, what is a thing that they're going to look at and be like, yeah, that's an idea that I would never have let him play with.
So give me an idea of what that might be, right?
Oh, yeah.
So
let's see. One of the things that I've done for a lot of it is for all of the optimism in all the various different settings, there's always an underlying layer of, if you choose to be selfish, if you choose to go that darker route for whatever reason, there's a built-in second layer that this is the bad thing that will happen if you make your decisions based purely on what's going to be good for me or how am I going to screw this other person over. And it's not necessarily being selfless is good and being selfish is bad, but it's more of your actions have consequences. Right. The best example I can think of for this is, as I mentioned, the floating city in the sky of, you never put a floating city in fantasy if it's not going to fall at some point. And there's the ongoing thing of the city's been flying for thousands of years, just weird inbred sorcerers bloodlines keeping it going. But the longer that city's been up there, the fewer sorcerers they've had and the stingier they've gotten with their own powers.
Interesting.
And the less magic the whole puts into the city, the harder it is to keep it in the air. And so it's that question of, yes, if everyone in the city just got together and mutually decided we're going to essentially pay our magical taxes so that, we can all stay up here, it would be fine. But nobody's doing that. And it's a very similar, thing for adventurers of, it's like, I want to do this thing. I want to solve this problem. It's like, okay, do you solve it the quick and dirty way and then have to deal with all the consequences that come with cutting those corners? Or do you, do a more complicated but longer lasting solution to this problem?
Right. Oh, that's cool. So let's go ahead and put that on the bookshelf, because I need to now transition to something completely different. So I want to talk a little bit about Army Men. So the snippet I found on Army Men is a nostalgia-hitting tactical tabletop role-playing game where you play the role of plastic soldiers in a war-torn world. And the impression I got, Neal, and help me or correct me if I'm wrong in this, is that this sounds like something you got pulled into. Is that accurate?
Yes and no.
How so?
The origin story for this happened many, many years ago in pre-quarantine days. But there was a friend of mine that I had known through various groups, and he decided, it's like, I'm gonna start my own gaming company like so many of us do. And I was like, I wish you luck in that endeavor.
You make tens of dollars.
There was a pause of like, oh, you wanted me involved in this. You weren't just sharing your intent. And so it was my question I always have when someone tells me that is, well, what's your budget? What do you want me to do? And so originally he put me on retainer to essentially create content for his blog so people could come by and get all the new information. And he eventually just decided, was like, I'm gonna make a game. I was like, okay. What do you want me to do? And he kind of wanted me to be like the driving force behind a game, and then his company would put it out. And so I kind of had a lot of creative freedom, but he had a very particular audience he wanted to hit for it.
What was that audience?
He wanted to hit that that tactical tabletop audience, the folks who like Axis and Allies, who like Warhammer, that sort of group. But the game he proposed for it was I think it was Fate is the game that he suggested, and that was the first time I put up my hand of like, yes, I appreciate that you were the boss and you signed my check, but you are not going to get the folks who like rolling lots of dice and measuring things with ruling stick into a game that has like 4 rules and most of them are optional. And so we went back and forth trying to figure out, it's like, okay, what game system is going to appeal to this group without being so niche that it's going to keep other people out? And because this was pre-OGL, we eventually decided, okay, let's just do 5th edition D&D. That's the one everyone knows, quote unquote, and we can get as many people into that with as few headaches as possible. Then we had the question of, okay, we've picked the system. What's the game?
Right.
And so I'd kicked around some ideas, and we knew we wanted to do something military-esque themed, but we didn't know what. And just after a long day of racking my brain, I was taking a shower, just trying to just get the frustration of the days off. Man, I had that moment of go down to the dollar store, I'll buy a cheap knockoff bag of Army Men. There you go. And I just stopped and I was like, that has to be an RPG. Someone must have made that an RPG before now. And then I looked and I was like, what do you mean no one's turned this into a game? It writes itself.
Yeah.
And then once I found that out, I was like, okay, here's my very silly pitch. And so it was it has a bit of the Pugmire tongue-in-cheekness to it of, we all know this is very silly, and we know this is like a future dystopian bit of sci-fi nonsense. To the characters, this is their world, and these are the struggles of their day-to-day lives. So you can play it either as silly as you want, or you can play it as like very dark and very like horrors of war, if that's what you want to do. You can do it either way. And I made it specifically for that because I like games that are flexible in tone. And I figured this would get the people who really want that, like, he's like holding your sergeant in your arms while he passes out and gives you a letter for his girl back home. Or you can have people who want to do like a plastic Rambo movie. You can do both.
So that flexibility in tone is tough, I would imagine, especially when you're creating a system, right? Like, how do you build it so that it can be so accommodating?
There is part of the inspiration for this, and it's a game that does not get enough love, so I'm going to give it a shout out. If anyone has not played Spycraft, it is a great game. But one of the things they did in the back of the book, it's a big old chunky rule book. It's a doorstop and a half. Oh, excuse me. But in the back of it, they had like several 2 to 3 page sections for your storytellers. And it was, here's how you gear this game toward all of these subgenres. So, the traditional game is very like James Bond, gadgeteer kind of spy movie. And then they had, here's how you do Hong Kong action theater. Here's how you do a noir private detective story. Here's how you do industrial horror. Here's how you do like modern kick in the door military adventures. And that kind of gave me that idea of like, well, we have this chassis. And as lots of designers have found, D&D 5e is very accommodating for doing lots of different things as long as you stick within a certain basic framework. And so I wanted to have kind of that big, loud, bombastic adventure of just you and your friends out on a mission trying to save whatever the objective is. Either it's, save the civilian populace from this enemy incursion, or hold the line while people are retreating, or whatever it is. And then, once you have that, then you can take that and translate it to, it's okay, now we want to do espionage stories. We want to do, our allies betraying us, are our secrets being stolen? Has something gotten out of one of our research bases? And then after that, it leads more into horror of like, we tried to make new weapons to win this war and they got away from us. And so now we have to deal with that. And then in addition to that, you have things I'm hoping to add in the future of, cops and robbers. If we want to do a very either gangster squad sort of thing of going after war profiteers who are trying to steal various munitions and sell them on the streets. If you want to do a Wild West story of people outside the traditional setups, because you have the extra like cheap figures of the cowboys and the Native Americans and the Civil War sets.
Yeah.
So then you have to fight giant insects with a cannon.
So Neal, I'm starting to now get a sense. This has been very helpful because I'm getting a sense of, when I first came across this, I was trying to have a hard time understanding. I could understand it as a tactical game. That's super easy, right? We start with miniatures. That makes it obvious. I was initially having a hard time understanding where the role play comes in, but I think you've helped me a lot there. What I don't have a sense of is, in character, what do they see in the world, right? Do they see a carpet, large living room, or is it a living, breathing world? Can you give me a sense of what's seen through the eyes of these army men?
Absolutely. I provided a full world, a full meta for everyone with the caveat of, but if you want to play this like Toy Story, you are free to do that.
Gotcha.
The game will work exactly the same way if that's what you want to do. But in the event that you want to do like the bigger, like more filled out, meta, I have that for people too. So we have, the peoples of the Plastos Federation, which is made up of the formerly 5, now 4 countries that all came together during the incursion of the Vespoids, which are the gigantic insectoid alien creatures that just showed up while they were all at war. And they all kind of mutually had that moment of, our war is not done, but that thing is a threat to all of us. So until those are dead, we are all on the same side. And that's sort of what's been going on in the setting for the past 50 years of they were at their not World War II. And in the midst of it, giant insects showed up and started fighting, and everyone just kind of mutually agreed is, okay, well, our armies are already in the field. We've deployed all these weapons. Just aim them that way.
Yep.
Yeah. And that led to a lot of restructuring of political alliances and a lot of changing of how we do certain tactics because, the bugs are not lining up and coming at us in neat formation and respecting the fact that we have trenches. They're just doing whatever it is bugs do. And because we're people, we have no idea what that's going to be.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. So same type of thing. So this was crowdfunded, right?
Yes.
When you started the crowdfunding, what condition was the game in?
It was, I would say, in its original conceived version, it was 98% done. With some of the changes we made to it, it was about 80% done.
Okay, and talk to me about the 2% and the 20%.
Absolutely. So when I first made the game, I was put on retainer. The way that I did it is essentially I wrote a chapter a month, and I got like a fee from my client just to help me keep the lights on and bills being paid while I worked on this big old honker of a project. And the idea was at the time to make it essentially a 5e add-on. The idea was people already had access to the base rules or they owned a rule book, so we didn't have to reprint all of the basic monsters and all the basic rules. Here's the things that are different.
Right.
And I wrote basically all of that myself. And I was most of the way into the introductory adventure at the end of the book, like that first module every game gives you. And that was when I got the call from my client of like, hey, it turns out I don't have the funds I thought I did. I'm going to have to close the company. And so I'm like, but I'm almost done. I have like 12 pages left. And so like after a couple of weeks, I called him up. I was like, hey, would it be cool if I went to another person with this? I know that you put in a lot of money and you helped fund all of this, but if I have a way to get it to the light of day if you want to see it published. And so he was very cool about it. And he said, yeah, absolutely. I was like, take the logo with the helmet and the army men on it was something he'd already had commissioned, which I was very grateful because that was a cool piece of artwork.
Yeah.
But so I went to High Level Games, who I had a previous working relationship with, and I had told some of the folks about it, and they were very excited, and they were very upset when they found out it was going to be canceled. And so I started working with them, and we had our meetings and figuring out, like, is what we have good, or do we need to change it? Do we need to bring in other stuff? And we sort of mutually agreed after going through it, particularly, especially after the OGL fiasco. It was like, okay, this needs to be a standalone game.
Interesting.
We need to take all the stuff that's in Creative Commons and use that. So we have all the standard rules of this is what advantage means and this is what light conditions are and all of those things. And we spliced those in along with all of the rules content I'd already created, all the unique monsters I had. We got an artist who's very, very talented and did a lot of amazing work. And at the end of it, what we have, it was one of my favorite little nods to it is Josh Heath, who's the fellow I was working on this with primarily, is a veteran, whereas I am not. But I come from a military family, so usually when he makes a reference, I get it.
Right.
And so we wanted it to look like one of the old military manuals.
Nice.
So, you open it up and it's full of all this vibrant art and all this cool stuff. But you look at the cover and it's like, no, this is mass produced, given to all the troops.
Oh, that's cool. That's very, very cool. And same question on reactions. So what were some of the things you heard as it went out into the wild, whether it be part of the playtesting or post-play testing? What were people saying that surprised you?
There were some things that surprised me And some things that surprised me how often I heard them.
Oh, okay.
It was one of those of, at this point, I believe like I started work on the game 5 years ago. It took a bit to get to where it is now. And it was designed, of course, publishing and designing and all that takes time. So if you're writing for the market at one point, there's no guarantee that's going to be the same market when you're going when you're going to funding and whatnot. And so trying to get everybody in on the Kickstarter, what 6-7 months ago would have been a slam dunk. Now you have all these people going, oh, why did you write it for 5th edition? As if I had just started working on it a month ago.
Sure.
So I had to explain to them, like, guys, I started work on this 4 years ago. As I've changed a lot of stuff. Here's all the new things I put in. Here's all the different stuff you can do that the traditional game doesn't do. And just explaining to everybody, it was like, no, this is not connected to Wizards of the Coast. This is an independent production. And I appreciated there were lots of people concerned about that because it was a very important thing for people to be aware of. I like consumers to be conscious, but it was very frustrating that I had to be the one to be doing that all the time.
Yeah.
The other part of it that there was one thing that I was surprised about, and it just proves that people who are, if you're paying attention, sometimes you don't pay attention hard enough and you just knee jerk into things. Like there were so many people who accused us of using AI art. And I had to keep sharing it. I'm like, this is not AI. Here's the artist. Here's the artist sharing the pieces while they're making them. Do not denigrate this work. This is awesome.
Yeah, I really don't know what's going to happen with all of that, Neal. And it's what you're talking about. I've started to see more and more of that where artists are like, I put my work through some of these test filters, right? That come back and say 87% chance it's AI art. And it's coming back like 98% AI art. He goes, I drew the goddamn thing. I know it's not, right? Like, it's going to be very, very interesting to see where this settles out. It really, really is. And I guess my question for you on that is, where are you? Because I'm all over the place, right? So I love original art. Like,
absolutely.
And I am a person who loves to create art, and I'm terrible at it, which makes me very appreciative of those people that have put in the time and the effort that I haven't to become very good at it. I also use Midjourney to create the thumbnails for my actual plays, right? So I'm all over the place on this, and I haven't figured it out. And when I hear one camp talk about it and say, painters said the same thing when photography happened, that it's going to destroy us and that nobody's going to want art anymore. Nobody's going to want portraits painted anymore because you can just take a picture. But that ended up not being true, right? But I also, especially when we get into where the DNA of AI is and the scraping that occurs, to allow AI to do what it is, that I get that argument too. Have you developed a thought on this yet? Or are you where I am, where I'm kind of all over the place?
Yeah, my general thought on it at this point is I am less interested in the technology and what it can and can't do, and I am more interested in how ethically did you acquire the training materials. Yeah. It was that moment I had when I looked at the Fantasy City generator, and I was like, oh my God, have I been doing this thing? And I stopped and I looked at it and I was like, no, all the art, all the assets in it were made by one person. So he made the entire program of all it does is remix these things that I drew, and so this is all my work, no matter what it is. Right. I was like, okay, that's fine. And he gave it all to us and said, you can do whatever you want with it. I was like, okay, we have artist permission, artist assets. Cool. Or if you have, a company that's like, these are all the art assets that we own and we have the permission from people to do this. So go forth, do the thing. But, it's when, they start scraping stuff off the internet or stealing various things from people. And it's a problem now, but it's also the bigger problem. It's not just the fight of technology versus artists, but it's that fight we see in a lot of our games, whether it's Cyberpunk or Shadowrun or whatnot. If it's always it's like, we have a new tool, let's stop paying people.
Right.
And it's that question of where does it end? Because it's one of those of like, yeah, you can get cool art and not have to commission an artist to do it. But now it's, corporations are not paying artists. We're not paying writers. We're not paying anybody because we think we can just push a button and make it happen. And that usually, from what I've seen, at least all the things I've seen of like the best AI can make a script that sounds like it was written by a 12-year-old. It's impressive that it managed that, but it's still not a very good script.
Yeah.
And so it's that whole thing of, I don't think it's exactly on like Skynet, waiting to take us out, but I would very much like to see it used for something not creating art, because there's so many other cool things AI could be used for that isn't going to hurt anyone and could help a lot of us.
Like what?
Like, I want AI to be like, hey, I've looked over your spending habits at the grocery store. It seems like you should be out of this, this, and this. I'm like, oh, I needed that. Thank you. Or if it's I see that these are bands that you enjoy. Would you perhaps like some of this other music in the same category? And that's the sort of thing I'd like it to. I'd like it to pay. I would like it to bring our attention to other artists, other creators who are making work that we normally wouldn't find. I would essentially like it to be a kinder, gentler algorithm.
All right. So now, as somebody who has spent a considerable amount of their time growing up reading speculative fiction, as a person who now creates speculative fiction, whether it's in the context of games or not, doesn't matter. It's still the same process, right? It's still the what if. And if this is true, that means what does it mean for this, right? And you did a great job of explaining that that's important to you, that if we accept that cities can float, what does that mean, right? And what does that mean about the rest of the world? And I said, all right, Neal, I'm going to fast forward us. I mean, I used to say for stuff like this, let's go fast forward 20 years. But you look at what has happened in AI in the last 18 months. We don't have to go that far. Where do you think we're going to be in 4 years? What's your guess?
My guess, and I'm hoping it's wrong, but my guess is we're going to see a lot of what we've seen with lots of different industries who have tried this with previous technologies, of whether it was, the early adoption of like computer filing systems when they weren't ready yet, or the early attempts to use like certain chemicals that weren't fully understood yet. I'm looking at the folks behind the Radium Girls.
Right.
But that idea of there's going to be a lot of people at the top making decisions that they are not well informed enough to make those decisions, who are going to be like, oh, it's like that sci-fi I read when I was young. Cool, let's do this, without understanding like, no, it's not that advanced. You cannot depend on it to do this. And they're going to go all in on something. And it's either going to destroy a lot of projects. It's going to hurt a lot of people's income. It's going to possibly just bankrupt a lot of efforts. It's, in my opinion, very similar to what we saw with the whole crypto craze. There's a lot of people who want to believe it does something it's not ready to do or was never intended to do, but they get very hooked on this idea of, I know it'll make me this overnight sensation, when in fact all it's going to do is like ruin the environment and steal your money. Yeah. And then they'll be back to where they were before, of like, oh no, we need to like pay people with talent and knowledge to make the thing when we could have just done that in the first place.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be very, very interesting. And one of the things, because this has become more and more of a topic on this podcast, right? As I talk to more and more creators, this is the hot topic. And it's very interesting to think about where it shakes out. And the analogy that keeps ringing with me, and I've already used it, is the photographer versus the painter. Because now we still have both. Oh, right. Yeah. And they are different, and they still are meaningful. But also, they're also their own art. So now we've said, okay, photography also needs a human. You can't just set up a tripod, flash the bulb, and now you can replace everything. Now we have art that's built around that. So it'll be interesting to see how creatives end up maybe using AI, right? And infusing that thing that we have yet to be able to replicate, which is that human creative spark. So speaking of creative sparks, we're going to take one more break. When we get back from this break, we're going to get to one of my favorite segments on the show. We're going to try to figure out what Neal's been grooving on. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for a D&D podcast with a dark side? Something more like Game of Thrones and less like Monty Python? Tale of the Manticore is part dark fantasy audio drama, part solo D&D RPG. There's no plot armor here. The dice make all the important decisions. Join me as I resurrect the excitement, wonder, and emotion of old school D&D. Made for a mature audience, Tale of the Manticore is both a fiction and a game. It's the story where chaos rolls.
So Neal, in the several years that I've had this podcast, this segment kind of like would peek in every once in a while as part of a side conversation. Then it became kind of a thing. And now listeners come back to me and say, my favorite thing is at the end when we find out what people love that are making things. So for you, you're making stuff. And one of the hopes I would imagine as a creator is that you hope that there's going to be people that your creations land on and they can't stop thinking about it. They want to, they read the first 3 books that we just talked about. And they're like, I need to get 5 more. Right. And they want to, they start going Army Men, and they cannot get the locals to the table fast enough to play Army Men because they can't stop thinking about it. When does that happen to you? Is there anything recently, a book, a game, prestige TV, movies, that something that got its hooks into you and you just couldn't let go?
Very recently, actually. I've been hyperfixating for about the past 2 weeks.
Okay.
I had so my regular Saturday group, it's essentially the game for, it's like, okay, we're done with D&D, we're done with Pathfinder, we're done with whatever the normal game is. Let's try something else. Maybe it'll be something everybody else hasn't played before, or it'll be just like, this is a game we don't get to play very often. Let's do a campaign of this.
Oh, that's great to have a group that does that. Yeah.
And so we started off with Dark Heresy, and that's starting to wrap up a bit. And I love 40K, and I've just been delving myself deeper into that for a while. But the fellow the person who's currently running that is finally trying to get me and a couple of the others who haven't played this one before, of like, okay, this is my favorite game. I know it might not be to everybody's taste, but I would really like it if you gave it a try. And I'm like, okay, I will give it a try. And it is Exalted.
Oh, interesting. Talk to me.
I've been dancing around Exalted for a while because I am a big fan of like White Wolf and Onyx Path. I'm very familiar with a lot of their World of Darkness games. I played Scion, and I've enjoyed all of those things. I have had a very contentious relationship with anime over my life. Mm-hmm. And so it's one of those, when it's described to me as like, it's very wuxia, like Journey to the West kind of game. I'm like, I don't know if this is the vibe for me. I don't know if you want me at that table.
Why do you struggle with it?
Honestly, it's a thing that I learned about myself very early on. If there's a thing, and it is a me as consumer, not
sure,
culture storyteller. But there's a thing, particularly with anime as a series, of it is not tonally consistent, and that bothers me.
Yeah.
So like if I show up for like a really grim or really, really like hardcore story, and then we have a beach episode, I'm like, what is this?
Yeah, and that's a core tenet of a lot of anime, is that shift of tone. Sure.
Yeah, so like a lot of the time I'll see later episodes from a series of like, ooh, this is really good. This is really dark. I like this. And I start off the first episode. I'm like, who's this idiot? Where's the guy from this? That happened with Trigun. The first episode of Trigun I saw was the one with Monev the Gale, when it's like a very hardcore duel in the middle of the town that leaves a bunch of corpses in the street. And then we go back to the first episode, and Vash is just stumbling around like an idiot eating a donut. But, it was just one of those. I'm like, okay, it's very important to you. I have not tried it. I have not even read the full thing yet. So I'm going to at least read it. I'm going to give it a try. And my game masters had that moment of, we've played together for many years and they know me very well. So it was like, okay, I normally wouldn't do this, but I know you. Here's a thing. And I'm reading through it. For those who are not familiar, of Exalted is a thing where you have mortal characters who are infused with a tiny spark of deific power, and they awaken and they become great heroes and go off and struggle against the challenges of the day in a very, very wild, very crazy setting. So, you have the Solars, who are your traditional mythical heroes who are perfect and godly in every way. And then, we have our Abyssals, who are our like undead anti-heroes, and they're awful and villainous. And then we have the Green Sun Princes, who are essentially just taken from hell to conquer the planet. And my storyteller hands me this thing, and I read through a bit of it. I'm like, this is awful. This is full of body horror. This is chaos and disgustingness. Are you sure you want me bringing this vibe to your table? Because I will do it in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
But it's one of those of like, you handed me a fully loaded gun and you're telling me to point it at whatever I want. Where's the catch?
So how do you contrast that then? I mean, first of all, have you guys started it yet?
Not yet. We have been doing a lot of background and character building. This is actually a thing I'm very guilty of in most of the games, particularly when the table is very big. Of like our Saturday group is like 8+ people. So there's a lot of us for a lot of story.
Oh, wow.
It's almost LARP structured, so we can have 2 or 3 different scenes going on at a given time. Just hitting my arm there. But it's a thing of I realized like there is a point at which the story is no longer within my control and we need to get everybody involved. So it's everything before that point is entirely up to me. So I sat down and I was like, okay, what kind of story, what kind of arc appeals to me most? And I love characters with a flat arc. For readers who are not sure about that, it's characters who are similar at the beginning and the end of their story. They don't achieve some great thing. They don't lose some great thing, but like the world around them is affected by their presence. So we see things like Conan. We see things like Solomon Kane, characters like that.
Yep.
And so I wanted to do a story I very rarely get to finish, and I very rarely get to finish satisfactorily. It's that story of like, the man who lost everything and is, trying to get it back. And there's the urge that we all have of it's the same story you see with, the Punisher and various other antiheroes of, is that my family is dead and I've lost everything. I'm like, no, just take about 20% off of that. Mm-hmm. So we had the whole thing of like, his wife was taken, his kids were taken, his village was burned down, he was enslaved, and just all the way down in the darkness of the mine he was sent to, like the devil held out his hand and said, you want to make a deal? And so now we have essentially the world that could very easily have stopped him from becoming this thing, now having to deal with the consequences of him being turned loose on the setting. But I've been slowly pulling all of the other players into the nonsense that I'm working on, because as word to the wise for any players who also very much enjoy this kind of arc, make sure that everybody is on board with your nonsense. Otherwise, it's very easy to get everyone very frustrated with you. And so it was kind of my preventative measure of I'm going around and being like, hey, I'm on like a quest for vengeance. Do you want to be my friend? And
so is there some tonal contrast that you're dealing with in that process, right? Because that's been your bugaboo, right?
Oh, yeah, there's a little bit of it. And there's some of it that's very fun. It's kind of a first come, first serve of who wants to add into the story of another friend of mine in the group that we've played. We've played several games together at this point. She was playing an Abyssal, who is, as I mentioned, our awful undead antiheroes. And she didn't really have a story. She just had kind of a vibe and an idea for her concept. So I was like, here's what I got so far. And I just see ... Can I get in on this? And I was like, yeah, sure. That's and cool. So we now have just to add into it of she is my character's sister-in-law. And so like his family's still missing, but she was taken at like the beginning of all of this nonsense. So there's that moment of, yay, I found someone. My family's not destroyed. What did they do to you?
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And then the villains are looking out at it and going, oh, God, there's two of them now.
So I can't let this 8+ thing go. I hard cap at 4 players when I run a game. I might allow 5, but that's the exception for me. What are you guys doing with 8 people? Like, that sounds insane to me, especially if you're playing like Pathfinder and D&D. Oh, like, yeah. Combat with 3 players takes, 2 hours. Like, what the hell are you guys thinking?
Yeah, I think, I've only done larger plays with this group with various Warhammer 40K systems, and now we're going to be doing Exalted. Mm-hmm. And I think the advantage of both of those two systems is that they're made for large scale stuff in mind.
Got it.
So it gives the storyteller a lot of extra guns to draw on. It's not all of you are ganging up on like villain du jour of this campaign. It's like, now you all are raiding a battleship the size of a county. I suggest you dodge. And so then you have challenges that kind of requires that number of people, but it doesn't feel forced. So you can have like a boarding action where you go in as 3 separate teams and you have to sort of coordinate what's happening, or you have, one team going in to like assault a compound and rescue some hostages and another team over here being a distraction. And it gives them a really handy way to split everybody up without making it feel like anyone's getting more attention than anyone else.
So now I'm going to get into some GM advice in that scenario, right? What's the blocking and tackling? What are some techniques that you're seeing that are working that allows 8 players to stay engaged? Because it would be so easy to have 2 of those people like just on the sidelines the whole time. So what are some techniques that you're seeing being effective that allows everybody, all 8 of you, to be leaning in the entire game?
Absolutely. It is a thing that has worked for Dark Heresy, and it is a thing I built into Army Men to bring it back around a bit. It was a thing of, because these games have like a military structure and they have like that rank and file, if you have players who are either more familiar with the setting or who are more active as like party leaders of like, these are the ones who make the plan and everyone's like, yes, sir, I'm going to go do the thing. And so you have two of us have kind of become unofficial like helper GMs.
Yep.
And so we have, it's because we have our Inquisitor, who is an NPC, and then we have like the two of us who are just kind of entrusted to go forth and do her duty. So occasionally, like, I'll just look at three of the other players and be like, you three, I want you doing this. And, we had established a relationship up to that point because I had purposely played the character who was familiar with the setting, who could explain to everybody what the heck it is they're looking at. So like he's kind of become like the gruff but lovable sergeant. So everyone's just used to doing what he tells them to do. And it means that the players don't get decision paralysis when you turn to them and go, okay, what do you want to do? And, they get that thing of like, I don't think that plan will work. We should do this instead. Well, you're the expert. Just make it happen.
Nice.
And so, they get to roll dice. They get to like get in on the discussion. And at the end of the day, like everybody got to do some part of the plan. And even in times where like my sergeant hasn't actually done anything, he didn't put a single finger on a trigger, I still got to feel like I participated because I'm helping move everybody around the battlefield. So I get the Hannibal moment of I love it when a plan comes together.
Oh, boy. So, Neal, there's a lot of really cool things to do on a Thursday night, like reading Exalted. And it's a lot more interesting than spending an hour with me. So I really appreciate you making the time, man.
Well, thank you much for having me on. It's been a blast.
And for those of you listening, this is the end. You made it. I appreciate you listening. Take care. I hope you enjoyed this talk with Neal as much as I did. Do you prefer to play your games in a city or a countryside setting? I'm dying to hear your thoughts. Please share your thoughts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, or email me at admin@thirdfloorwars.com. Your voice matters, and all those links are in the show notes. Please take a minute to rate and review and share this podcast. Word of mouth is the key to growing Tabletop Talk. You're going to want to catch the next episode. I talk with Matt and John about the newest Conan RPG crowdfunding soon. Happy gaming, friend. Remember what Steve Jobs once said: creativity is just connecting things. Get up and make. You are a creator. Great segment, dude. Thanks for following me on that. That was great.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is a topic I don't get to talk about very often, so I'm interested.
It's been a big pillar for this show is that I always end up finding something in this discussion as I try to learn that we always end up in a place that ends up being the best part of the podcast, which is, and I guarantee people listening are gonna be like, I really liked the discussion on AR, which you and I had no intention of talking about.
Victory.
It ended up being super interesting. All right. So the idea here is I'm not interested in what you make anymore. We're done with that. I want to talk about what you consume. Okay. All right. I'll bring us back. Hey, are you still here? Look, the podcast is over. And you sat through all of the breaks and bloopers? Well, I mean, if you're here, you might as well run over to patreon.com and become a supporter. Don't forget to rate and review this podcast too while you're at it, on whatever platform you're listening to. I do appreciate you sticking around. Take care.